千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we delve deeply into the Daodejing by Lao Tzu. So previously, we looked at the entire chapter, and this is actually it. It is the shortest chapter of all of the Daodejing chapters, all 81 chapters. This is the shortest one with the 4 lines. But it turns out there's a lot to talk about. With the 4 lines, we can break down into 2 sets of couplets, 2 sets of 2 lines each. So we identify the repeating characters, as you can see on the left-hand side, and the 2 lines that form a poetic pair are identified as such, can be easily seen as such. So we put the line right down the middle between line 2 and line 3, dividing this short chapter of 4 lines into 2 parts with 2 lines each. We were able to talk about just line 1, and that is because within this very simple line, the returning is the movement of the Tao. It got us into a discussion about the Great Circle. The returning movement of the Tao is depicting the circular motion that is characteristic of the Tao. So there's a lot to talk about there because it applies to so many different aspects of life. We got into all kinds of discussions, and we also talked about how to apply that to life at the human level. And today, we're going to continue that discussion. Let me show just a few recap slides, get everyone all caught up. So when we talked about the returning as movements of the Tao, characterizing that as circular motion, the suggestion that I have for everyone was to think about the pendulum. So the pendulum doesn't necessarily travel in circular fashion, but it's definitely back and forth. It's there and then back, and then there again and then back. So that is actually a pretty good visual for life itself, the life that you and I live. We experience many transitions. So there's this metaphysical pendulum that goes back and forth in life. Things are pretty good one day, not so good the next day, and then back again. So the example that I used before to depict the pendulum in motion in one's life, the example that I used was the saying, as you may recall, cry in the dojo, laugh on the battlefield, where the dojo is martial arts training center. To cry in the dojo, or the martial arts training center, means the training is hard. The training is demanding, it's exhausting. So it's not good times. It's not happiness and bliss as you are in the dojo training yourself. But if you put in the work, it has rewards. Laugh on the battlefield means when it comes time to apply the martial arts skills for which you have trained yourself, you are proficient, you are victorious, hence you laugh on the battlefield. That is one example of going from the misery of training to the triumph in battle. So that's a transition from what seems like a negative thing to what seems like a positive thing. I say seems negative or positive because these states, as I described them, were all transient. They go back and forth. Just because you are experiencing victory today, it doesn't guarantee what comes next. It doesn't mean that you will always be victorious. Indeed, the content, the state of victory will pass. Then you may find yourself facing defeat. How can that be? Well, in typical life scenario, in this we have seen in ourselves and more likely in other people as well, and that is a situation where someone is victorious but then becomes arrogant. Because of the arrogance, they become careless. Because of the carelessness, they experience defeats. So they've gone from the thrill of victory to dejection, depression of defeat. Then, if they regroup, rally, and then work harder to prepare themselves next time, they can transition from defeat back to victory again. So life is like that, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The other example that I used previously was about getting sick and then healing up, getting better. And then at some point later, you're going to be injured or ill again, and then you will get better from that again. It's like that in life. So I'm describing this process of suffering, and then the ease of suffering, and then suffering again. So naturally, one question that I needed to explore from before was, is this like Buddhism? Buddhism talks about suffering, right? Okay, well, not quite. And there's a difference between the way that it is approached in Buddhism versus the way it is approached in the Tao. So I went into the practices of Buddhism in some detail previously to be able to use comparison and contrast to explain the Tao perspective. So here's the slide that I showed before with the symbol for Buddhism on the left, and then symbol, the yin and yang symbol representing the Tao on the right. So as a simplification of Buddhist concepts, I began with the concept of dukkha, which is the word that is often translated as suffering, although the original formulation of the Sanskrit word dukkha has connotations that's not perfectly translated into English as suffering. In Mandarin, it is 苦, as in bitterness. And life, 人生, is described as 苦海, 人生苦海, 苦海 meaning the bitter ocean, the ocean of bitterness. So it just means that life is not perfect, that there's always going to be problems, and even when during the short time that there are no problems, it is a temporary transient state, you will quickly transition, the pendulum swings again, back into suffering again. So happiness never lasts. So in the Buddhist perspective, life is about dukkha. The truth about life is all about dukkha, and therefore the goal is to be liberated from having to experience dukkha over and over again. The wheel of samsara is the wheel of birth, life, and death, and then rebirth. So it is a cycle that repeats itself. The goal of Buddhism is to liberate yourself from samsara. Because of that, it makes a lot of sense to, in the authentic teaching of Buddhism, to detach from everything. If you are attached to the good things in life, you're not going to want to leave the cycle of samsara, so it makes sense. You want to detach from everything, negative as well as positive. That's the part that many Westerners don't really get into when it comes to Buddhism. The third point that you see here, detachment from everything, even the good, happy things in life, it flows naturally from the first and second points. But we don't get that here quite so much, because this is the reason why I say the version of Buddhism here in the West is more like Buddhism light. There's little to no emphasis on austerity. Authentic Buddhism is about letting go of everything, therefore living in as austere a fashion as possible. And there are still Buddhist monks who follow that. They own little to nothing. They get by with alms, with the begging bowl. That is the original, authentic practice of Buddhism that's been prevalent in China throughout most of Chinese history. So because of that, to those who grew up with Buddhism in Asia, it's a little strange here in the West to see this somewhat twisted version, Buddhism light, that emphasizes bliss, blissed-out meditations, smiling Buddhist practitioners who smile all the time and smile for no reason because everything's so perfect. Wait a minute, that is not quite the authentic Buddhism that we remember back in Asia. Now, I do also want to make the point that if you ask Asians themselves about the difference between Buddhism and Tao, they can't necessarily tell you either, because they grew up with both and it's all mixed together. They influence one another. They can't necessarily tell you what is from a Buddhist tradition and what is from a Tao tradition. Here in this slide, I can show you in blue the difference, the actual difference. So before we leave this slide, let me emphasize that there's a whole lot of people in the West who are not aware that the Buddhism here is not like Buddhism there. A lot of times, Buddhism, as it's practiced in the West, is more like New Age beliefs with a new coat of paint. So what about the Tao? Well, the essence of life is not suffering. The essence of life is constant change. I'm about to back up the statements in just a moment. We get into a whole big discussion on change and the cycles of change later on today. Now, if the essence of life is constant change, then it makes sense that our goal in life is to master the inevitable transitions from one state to another. Things are always going to be going from bad to good and from good to bad. If we master the transitions, we can maximize, optimize the good, minimize, sometimes even sidestep or avoid the bad. And as we're doing that, it isn't the end results that we focus on. Rather, it is the process. This is just like saying life is about the journey, not the destination. And let me also give you another one, another way to think about this, another way to think about detaching from the end results, focus on the process. Think about expert surfers as they are riding the waves. The important thing is the process of riding the waves. They could care less where they are exactly, where they end up exactly in the ocean when a run has completed its course. When they're done with one particular run, they go back for more. It's always the process of surfing and not where they end up. That is the important thing. So it's the same in the Tao. It is what applies to life from a Tao perspective. Okay, so I hope everyone got that impression from last time. So now let me talk about change. Then we can talk about the cycles of change. They are sort of one and the same topic. In order to do that, I want to make sure everyone understands the original purpose of Tao cultivation. I mean, here we are today. We're all gathering together talking about the Tao. Why do we do this? What is the purpose? The original purpose. Well, let me talk about the original book describing the original purpose of the Tao, of studying the Tao. The original book is not the Daodejing that we're studying today. Those of you who have followed my lectures over the years, you know what I'm about to say. I'm going to say that the original book, the first book about the Tao, is Jing. So I know a lot of people will say Ching or Ching. Actually, it's Jing, and the I and the Ching that you see there, this is just the first attempt to Romanize. Jing is supposed to sound like Jing, but nobody knows that, so it gets mispronounced. So Jing is the book of changes. The first character, Yi, means change. Jing means sutra or classic. So it's the classic about change. Now, let me ask everyone the following question. Why is it important for us to understand change? To the ancients, what was so important to understand about change? I Ching started out as attempts to understand nature, and a big part of that was the understanding of weather patterns. To the hunter-gatherers in primitive times, it was essential to understand weather patterns. They needed to plan hunting and gathering sorties accordingly. They needed to pick the right time to do what they need to do for the tribe to survive. Then, this went on to the study of seasonal patterns. Seasonal patterns, as in the change of seasons, this became increasingly important as hunter-gatherers transitioned into an agricultural context. Farmers needed to understand seasonal patterns, and it turned out that seasons were cyclical, repeating, predictable patterns. And the study of these patterns, when we talk about the weather or seasonal patterns, these have to do with patterns in heaven and earth. We look to the heaven to see different weather. We look around at the environment to see the change of season. So it turns out that not just heaven and earth, but the patterns exist everywhere else too, i.e., in human life. So there are 4 things in general that was important to the ancients to understand about change. Number 1, why and how a particular change happens. Both the why and the how are important. And when it comes to weather, you can see, well, when the dark clouds gather overhead, that's a signal that a change is about to occur, as in change of precipitation. Rain is about to come down. So it's important to understand, be able to see the signs to know why and how a particular change occurs. Number 2, factors contributing to its cause. When you get from the weather to human affairs, you quickly see that a lot of times it isn't any single contributing factor that caused something to occur, but it can be a confluence of events that is the underlying cause. If so, a lot of these factors may be significant and important, and it's important to know what they are, so the next time there's a similar gathering of conditions causing the change, you can anticipate the change. So there's a number 3, the effects it will have. So the change is happening, it's going to have an impact on you, the people around you, the environment. So what is the effect? What is the impact? It's important to understand that as well. Is it positive or negative? Is it temporary? Is it permanent? What kind of effects? And lastly, and the most important one, the patterns that the change follows. So let me pause here for a moment and let me say that people use I Ching to do divination, meaning fortune telling. And a lot of times they marvel how accurate it is. So why is it so accurate? Why does it seem so supernatural and so amazing? I get asked that question a lot. Now, when you see the original purpose for studying the Tao and how the I Ching came about, you can begin to see, to glimpse perhaps, the reason why it is so accurate. It is accurate because it models the repeating, predictable patterns in life. So when it tells you about how things will pan out, you think of it as fortune telling, foretelling the future, divination. From the perspective of the original Tao sages, they're only telling you what the typical pattern is of how things will play out. It's a pattern like the change of seasons that's happened before and will happen again. And the pattern that we talked about just a moment ago, success leading to arrogance, leading to failure, that's one of the patterns described in the I Ching. So because of that, I want to ask everyone to pay attention to how the Tao is really about the transitions, the changes, and how we can understand the transitions and therefore master them. That's the simple one sentence nutshell. That's the Tao in a nutshell right there. And in this chapter, we use the pendulum as a metaphor for the transitions. It goes from bad to good to bad to good to bad to good, etc. It just keeps going. And now that you understand the pendulum metaphor, I think you will also be able to understand the following. Here's the slide that I've kept very simple for emphasis. This is a question for everyone. If you don't understand the pendulum well, let me ask you, what happens when the pendulum turns into a wrecking ball? In other words, when the change in your life occurs, what happens when it wrecks your life? Can something like this happen? Yes, it can. And let me incorporate the feedback and the ideas that I have heard over the years, including from today. Most of the time, when we look at circular motion, people have a tendency to think that it's back and forth, staying at the same place. But in reality, though, it's actually not just circulating forever. There's always a movement in the third dimension, which causes the circular motion to become a spiral like a spring. Think of a spring. Whenever you study or master a particular subject, in the course of your study, you're going to learn something, you're going to experiment, and sometimes you succeed, sometimes you fail, but you learn something from it, and then you attain the next level. You go up higher to the next level, and then you repeat the process all over again. So you circle back and forth. In every level, you go from beginning to expert. And then you go to the next higher level where you are again the beginner, and then after some time, the expert, and then the next level, and then the next level, and so on. That looks like a spring. It looks like spiraling process ever upward. But the opposite can occur. We talk about how the death spiral can occur when something is going bad and not getting better. that's the other direction. It still looks like a spring. But as you're circling, you are literally like water being drained from a bathtub. You are draining down and down and down. It's a spiraling pattern downward. So the circle occurs regardless, but the direction, ascending or descending, that's up to you. So yeah, pendulum is one way to think about it. Spiral will be another. Let's stick with the pendulum for now. I want to get everyone to focus on this idea of how the pendulum can become a wrecking ball. Can it happen? Yeah, let me give you some extreme examples on how it can happen, and then we'll work our way to the ordinary, everyday life. So here's how it looks. I'm going to give you some interesting statistics. The first one comes from the National Endowment for Financial Education. According to that organization, it's kind of shocking, but here it is. About 70% of all lottery winners end up broke. This is something that you can look up online. 70%. Wow. A lottery winner, maybe someone who receives this tremendous windfall, millions of dollars. So most of them, it's not even just, barely over half, it's most of them, 70% end up broke. So when someone wins the lottery, that person may be thinking, my fortune has changed. My luck has turned. But if they belong to the 70%, then in comes the wrecking ball. The pendulum, representing a turning of the fortune, is actually the wrecking ball that comes in and smashes everything. So how common is this? Well, it's not just lottery winners. No, it's a pattern that shows up elsewhere as well. Take a look at the following. 60% of NBA players and 78% of NFL players go bankrupt within 5 years after leaving their sport. Is that astonishing? I know that is shocking to me. Today's professional athletes, whether they play basketball for the NBA or football for the NFL, they're all millionaires. As long as they're active, they're earning the big salaries. Everything seems like a bed of roses. But then these athletes have to retire pretty young, much younger than the retirement age of the typical white-collar worker. So while still in their what we consider middle age, they retire, leave their sports, and within 5 years, they go broke. As you look at these statistics, I would like you to keep one thing in mind. These numbers that you see here, 70%, 60%, 78%, these are the people that have filed for bankruptcy. It does not include the people who are doing badly, but have yet to cross the line into declaring bankruptcy. It means among those who get a great windfall in general, probably 8 or 9 out of 10 end up not doing well, years down the road. It's only the 1 or 2 out of 10 that can avoid a similar fate. Folks, this is why it is so important to master the Tao, and therefore master change, and therefore master life. You can just imagine these professional athletes may be ecstatic when they say, hey, I got picked for the draft. My fortune has changed. My luck is turning. Everything is going to be easy from here on out. Well, they don't realize that it's actually a wrecking ball. The same thing can apply to all of us who are not lottery winners or professional athletes. It's all about success and failure at the personal level. It's all about what applies to you and me. Every day, we all have our little triumphs, little moments of good fortune. We may think, my luck is turning. I've turned the corner, I've hit rock bottom, and now things are just getting better. If we don't master the change, if we don't understand the Tao, it's very likely, it may be 8 or 9 times out of 10 that it turns into a wrecking ball. Hence, here we are, studying the Tao, studying cycles, studying changes and transitions. It's all about the main purpose of why we do what we do, why we gather every Sunday to talk about this stuff. We're studying the cycles, the changes, the transitions, so that it doesn't matter where the pendulum is at, we will know how to handle the swing of the pendulum. Still sticking to the pendulum metaphor for now. So when things are good, and if this describes you, please let me know. When things are good, what do we do when we study the Tao? Well, how do we understand it differently than most people? Well, the previous chapter to this one, we're on Daodejing chapter 40 now. The previous chapter was 39. At the very end of it, it's telling us very clearly that when things are good, when you attain a level of achievement, you have to be ever more humble. You have to hold on to the discipline, the practice in the virtue of humility. You have to guard against complacency. When you become complacent, that's the recipe on how your success can suddenly collapse, sometimes overnight. So when things are good, by mastering the Tao, you will know how to handle the good so that the change does not become a wrecking ball. What about the other way? Let me ask everyone, what does the Tao tell us when things are bad, when things are not so great? Yeah, it's good that you tell me to be humble when things are good, but things are not good right now. What do we do then? What does the Tao tell us when things are bad? Well, one of the key points that I mentioned last Sunday was that this chapter, chapter 40, it's close to the very center of the Daodejing. Chapter 41 is the real center, but in chapter 40, it's reflecting on the outer lines of the Daodejing. One of the chapters that it reflects and emphasizes is Daodejing 23. In 23, what is said in metaphorical language was that the strong wind does not last all morning. The sudden rain does not last all day. What it was trying to say was to let all of us know that when things are bad, it doesn't last forever. We know that it's going to pass. We know that it's temporary because, boy, that metaphorical pendulum never stops going back and forth. So it's going to swing around again. And because of that, because we know that it's temporary, that it's going to change, we can remain spiritually strong. We can hold on to hope. I definitely talk to quite a few friends who feel depressed because for them, things are pretty bad right now for a whole host of reasons, for a whole bunch of reasons. Then I have to tell them, number one, and number two, that it ain't gonna last forever. That's number one. Number two, because of number one, you must remain spiritually strong and hold on to hope. Change is coming. Because change is coming, you have to prepare for that. Number 3, prepare for the inevitable change. So for someone who may be, for instance, out of work, he may be depressed. He may be losing all hope, contrary to number 2. But if because of depression, he then falls into this apathy and doesn't do anything, well, when the change occurs and there's an opportunity presenting itself, he may not be ready to take advantage of it. So what I always say to people in that situation is that this is a wonderful opportunity for you to recharge your batteries, to train yourself to become a more valuable employee so that when opportunity comes, you can capitalize on the opportunity. So prepare for the inevitable change. That's number 3. Why do we do that? Because of number 4. When the pendulum reverses course, when the bad turns into good, be ready. Be ready to take full advantage when the pendulum is swinging in a positive direction. So there you go, mastering change. That is the reason why we do what we do. So this chapter is talking about something that's very profound, something that we all need to be reminded of every now and then. Why do we study the Tao? This is why. Now, let's continue on to line 2 of the Daodejing. That's right. After all that, we've only covered line 1, but I'm happy to say that we have covered line 1 in a complete and thorough fashion. I don't think I myself have ever covered line 1 in such a level of detail before. Let's talk about line 2. Line 2 starts out talking about the weak. So that's the first 2 characters that you see there. First character is simply Mandarin for weak or weakness. The second character means he who, she who, they who, that which is, those who are. So it's one character that serves all of those functions. Putting the 2 together, you get a literal transcription of something like those who are weak, they who are weak. But translated as the weak, I need to emphasize that this is not talking about weakness in the conventional sense. This is a little bit different, and let me explain. This has a specific Tao orientation and Tao definition and meaning associated with it. The weak, in this case, is not about the powerless. It's not about those who are lacking physical or spiritual strength. No, it's about something else. It's about the soft and flexible and pliant. What is it? It specifically refers to things that exhibit flexibility and pliancy. Living things, things that are alive. So forget about the weak for just a moment. Substitute instead the things that are alive, the things that exhibit the softness of life. That is the utilization of the Tao. Now it becomes clear that line 2 is talking about how the Tao drives the function of life force among myriad things, or whatever it is that causes life to proliferate. We call that the Tao. That is the reason why water is such a fitting metaphor for the Tao, because all living things depend on water for nourishment. Same with sunlight. So one example that we can use to associate life with softness would be babies, infants. Infants are full of life and therefore also full of softness. And infants are not strong, they're weak, but they're very flexible. The dead, on the other hand, are stiff and brittle. So that's the contrast. That makes it about as clear as it can be, as the examples can be, that softness, life, tough, brittle, stiffness, death. This applies mentally too. If you have a flexible mindset, your mind is full of the energy of life. If your mind is dogmatic, all made up, inflexible, unyielding, well, in a real sense, your mind is associated with death. Now, fortunately, it is possible for the mind to go from one state to the other. It can go from, being associated with death, dead to all new information, to back to the flexibility of life once again. Although I must say, from personal experience, it is not easy or common for that to occur. So let's talk a little bit more about this whole idea of the weak and how it is associated with the Tao and later on to life. So think about this. The Tao is life-oriented. Therefore, the Tao is not about being tough or strong or brittle, inflexible, etc. It's not about being aggressive. It's not about being forceful. The Tao is always life-oriented in the following sense. It's about the light touch, the soft whisper. The Tao is about the soothing, the healing, and the relaxing. All of those characteristics are deeply associated with the Tao. The Tao is about you being thoughtful and considerate to others. Whenever you see someone else being thoughtful and considerate to you, that person is definitely in tune with the Tao. Lastly, the Tao is about letting go of the need to control or interfere. I would even add the need to contend. The people who are always spoiling for a fight, they are not congruent with the Tao. In the Tao, there's no need to control anyone. There's no need to interfere with anyone else's business. So these are the implications of being soft or applying the teaching of softness to life. So, as we're talking about the weak, there's a little bit more that I'll say about that. It's basically applying how water is a fitting metaphor for the Tao. So I think what we can do is that we'll go one more slide and then we will take a 5-minute break. So all of the characteristics that we have talked about so far, they're all life-affirming and they all promote the general welfare of everyone. It is the same with water. With water, think about how water reacts to obstacles. Water flows around them. Water doesn't stick around to pick an argument with obstacles. It simply flows around. And by the same token, water doesn't need to pick a fight with anyone. Water, in flowing around obstacles, can potentially also be sidestepping conflicts. Water moves on. Water keeps flowing, doesn't stop. And water, as we pointed out just a moment ago, it nurtures the myriad things. Now, to emulate water for you, it means that you nurture everyone around you. That is to say, you provide them with guidance, you provide them with mentoring, you are good to them, quote unquote. That's being like water. Just as water is to the myriad things, so are you to everyone around you. And then water is what the Tao identifies as the ultimate in softness. So in the Daodejing, it says that nothing is softer than water. Water is the ultimate in softness. It is the ultimate in weakness and flexibility. At the same time, water is also the ultimate in authentic power. So that's it about the weak. So the weak, even these two characters have a huge amount of meaning embedded in them. I wanted to make sure that we cover all of them. And we're going to take a break for 5 minutes. When we come back, we will talk about the remaining three characters, the utilization of the Tao. So let's go ahead and take 5. Okay, time for us to continue in our discussion of line 2 of Daodejing, chapter 40. So what's next? As we're done talking about the weak, we now want to talk about the utilization of the Tao. So we've seen how the weak is seen as really life, that which is full of the softness of life. This is the utilization of the Tao. Let's talk about what that means. So first of all, the Tao is the principle behind everything. Therefore, it is also the driving force behind life itself. So when I talk about life, I'm talking about biology, procreation. Here, when I say flora and fauna, I just mean this includes animals and plants. It includes everything, all the living things. So now, a little bit of a challenge for everyone. I want to ask everybody to look at line 1 and line 2. Line 1, if you follow the discussion, is about this circular movement, this circular motion of the Tao. The great circle is what we call it. And then number 2 is about the Tao functioning as the driving force behind life itself. So we've got life as line 2, we've got circle as line 1. Here's the challenge. What is the connection between the two? The first 2 lines talk about circular movements and the process of life. What is the connection? Can you bring them together to one thing? And I can see that you guys are on the right track, on the same mental bandwidth as myself. Circle of life. And perhaps for many of you, that song starts playing in your head. Circle of life. Okay, we're about to get into that. Let's talk about life, circular movements in general, and let's talk about that circle in different contexts, in different levels of existence, not just life, but also beyond life. So the first thing that I'm doing in this slide is that I'm quoting from line 1, which is that the returning is the movements of the Tao. So the point that I want to make here is that when I say the Tao, I'm talking about every level of existence, not just the human level, not just the level of life that we live every day. We have to talk about everything in the typical Tao fashion in a specific sequence. What is the sequence that I'm talking about? Well, it's, first of all, the world, which is heaven and earth. So we start with heaven, and then there's a level of earth. We were talking about life just now, so we must include the level of the myriad things, meaning the living creatures, living things. Then we also have to talk about human beings, because that's who we are. In the 4 levels that you see here, please keep the following in mind. First of all, each level follows and reflects the higher level. And I'm about to give you a lot of examples of how the reflection and the following occur. Another important thing is that because of the mutual reflection, the mirroring of the patterns among the different levels, we find that we can understand one level better just by observing a different level. We can understand how human beings interact with one another by observing how the heavenly patterns manifest, how seasonal patterns manifest, etc. So I'm going to give a lot of specific examples on how we understand the big, the macroscopic from the microscopic, and vice versa. So let's start with heaven. When the ancients observed heaven, the most obvious circle of all is the cycle of change from day to night and back to day again. That is the most obvious one. Immediately evident to the ancients, the transition from day to night and back again. If you were in ancient primitive times, you will probably note that even if you weren't informed of anything else, you would note right away about the change in day and night, today again. So definitely you can observe, and then you can see the position of the sun throughout the entire day. You can note the transition. Eventually, you get the cycle down to something that looks like sunrise to the middle of the day, the midday sun, which is the high noon. And then at some point, sunset. Then it gets dark and it continues on until midnight, which is the opposite of high noon. And then at some point after that, back to sunrise. So there's actually 4 phases, and then repeating back to the first one to reiterate for another cycle, right? This is basic. This is elementary. So I think everyone looking at this immediately you can see that, oh yeah, this is the most basic, most evident cycle of all. So the ancients observed continuously and uncovered more patterns. For example, after many weeks, the ancients could also perceive the circular phases of the moon. The circular phases of the moon, you now know that it would take months to observe the repeating pattern. Well, the ancients definitely had that time, and they certainly had the same thinking ability that you and I do, so they were able to pretty much quickly formulate their own conclusions. And you can also divide it up into different phases. The actual phases of the moon isn't just these, but let me talk about these and then we'll go to the actual phases. New moon, okay, that's when you can't see the moon at all. First quarter of the moon is showing, and then full moon, and then third quarter, and then back to new moon again. So here I have the 4 major phases as well. Now, like I said, when we actually study the phases of the moon, it's actually like 8 phases. It goes from new moon to waxing crescent to first quarter to waxing gibbous to full moon, waning gibbous, third quarter, waning crescent, and then back to new moon again. Rather than to talk about all that, I'll just represent it pictorially like this. The bottom line, though, the important thing is to note that you can see the cycle taking shape. You can see the repetition. Now, of course, to the ancients, when they saw the day and night transition, to them, it looked like the sun was going around the world instead of the world going around the sun. By extending the period of observation from days to months, the point in the second half of the slide is that you see a bigger circle, the big cyclical change that takes months to really spot. So there's more. Looking at the heaven, studying the nighttime sky, ancient astronomers saw that stars, constellations, all moved in circular fashion. Now, today, with more knowledge than the ancients, with scientific disciplines that we pretty much take for granted now, we know we have additional facts that we've been taught. We know, for instance, that the moon orbits the earth. We know that the earth orbits the sun. And we also know that the sun orbits the center of the Milky Way galaxy. So the more we learn about the universe, the more examples of circular movements we uncover. So it's kind of interesting to me that the ancients had no detailed knowledge of astronomy. They had what they could observe, which was often quite a bit. They didn't have an accurate model representing the universe, but they figured out the circular movements on their own. You know, without the advanced telescopes, without the current modern understanding, they were nevertheless able to figure out quite a bit. Now, I want to take everyone from the level of heaven to the level of earth. So we're still talking about circular movements. Now we're talking about how the earth moves in that same fashion, and it's following heaven and reflective of heavenly movements. So in Daodejing chapter 25, it says, 地法天, which means earth follows the laws of heaven. You can think of it as the patterns of movements on earth follows the pattern of movements in the heavens. Another way to say it, the circular movements of heavenly bodies are reflected at the earthbound level. Of course. Let's take a look at some examples. First of all, high and low tides caused by the moon. Well, yeah. So the ancients did not know about gravitational pull, but they could definitely correspond the phases of the moon, position of the moon in the sky, high and low tides. It didn't take long for them to come upon that realization, and it was imperative for fishermen and mariners in general to know, because they needed to apply their trade or plan a voyage. So it made sense. Crucial knowledge for fishermen and mariners. Now, there's more. Think about the changing of seasons. Well, that's the change in the earth's, in the environments that we see around us. Every season brings about different changes, but it's actually reflective of two things that we know from science: that the earth is tilting at an angle and it's rotating in orbital plane around the sun, and therefore we're going to have the different seasons. This is crucial knowledge for farmers, of course. So we're seeing cycles everywhere in heaven and in the earth. So for the earth, the seasonal changes are, of course, spring, summer, autumn, winter, the four phases, and then back to spring again. Now, we've talked about heaven and earth. Next, we should talk about the myriad things. So what about the cycles related to that? Circular movements related to that? Well, in a similar way, The circular movements of Earth are reflected at the level of the myriad things. How does that work? Here's a couple of examples. We know that many animals go on migration, seasonal migration. The animal migration occurs on a seasonal basis, and that just means that the migration follows the patterns manifested at the level of the earth, which is the changing of seasons. Another circle that we note in all living things is, here we go, the circle of life. So there's that song again playing in everyone's head. And what it means is when something dies, it gives new life to another. It is the sacred interchange of life and death in nature. Now we see this at work in, for instance, how the corpse of animals provide nutrients to plants, which in turn feed herbivores. Herbivores themselves are prey for carnivores, predators, etc. So it goes on. The one thing that I want to point to in all of this, in the circle of life, is that everything, absolutely everything is used. Everything gets recycled. Nothing ever goes to waste. And that seems to be a characteristic of existence everywhere. Remember this, everything is recycled. Nothing ever goes to waste. It's a perfect system. So now we're ready to talk about human beings. And as you can see, these are heavy-duty topics that we get into just by virtue of talking about life and the great circle of the Tao. Let's talk about human beings. So first of all, we are among the myriad things. We're living creatures. We're life forms too. We partake in all the characteristics of the myriad things, plus much more, because we human beings have additional characteristics beyond that of plants or animals. So think about this for a moment. All of us, individual human beings, we are finite. We know we're here now, but we know that we're going to be going away at some point, perhaps decades from now. So we human beings are finite. But when we talk about family trees, when we talk about lineage, family lineage, well, families continue on. Family members cycling through life stages indefinitely. So you may not last indefinitely yourself. I won't last indefinitely myself. But in a family, we know that members of the family will go through the same life stages: birth, childhood, youth, maturity, old age, and death. Now, I hope you notice the difference here between what I'm depicting in blue versus what I depicted before in previous slides in blue. For all of those, I end with a reiteration of the first phase. In this case, I start from birth, end in death, because that is the popular conception. That is the fear for many, that death is the end of the journey, the end of the process. I just want to point out for everyone that this is not the case with everything else. With everything else, the cycle begins again. So I want to suggest, I want to present the idea that it would be the case for human beings as well. For now, though, I want to, before we leave the topic of human beings, I want to also make sure we talk about the interactions that we have to one another. So in this case, I call it the karmic circle as opposed to the circle of life. And this is about our interactions with one another because they take on circular characteristics as well. So let me talk about this for a moment. As we interact, we put out energy from us to someone else. That energy can be positive or negative. If we give someone kindness, if we show compassion, that's positive energy going out. Conversely, if we lash out at someone, if we blame, criticize, accuse, that's negative energy going out. If we inflict harm, whether physical or otherwise, that's negative energy going out. So as the energy goes out, time passes, and some people forget about that energy that's gone out. But at some point, the same energy comes back, except that it's amplified and magnified many times. We've all seen this happen. Sometimes the middle phase, time passes, takes, in our opinion, way too long. It takes too long for karma to show up again. Sometimes it is instantaneous, other times it can take years. Either way, just like it is with the pendulum, the cycles, the circular motions in the Tao is inevitable. So it's got to come back. It must be coming back. So there's more to say about how we are as human beings when it comes to circular movements. Let me ask everyone this question. What about the soul or spirituality? If you would rather not buy into the concept of a soul, then I'll just say consciousness. Human consciousness, what about that? How would circular movements of the Tao apply to human consciousness? So this is different and apart from birth and death of the physical human body. I think everyone sees where I'm going with this. So I want to return again to the topic of samsara, the wheel of samsara. And here you will see the Mandarin characters that I have provided here, 轮回. This is how it is expressed in Mandarin. This, of course, is the Buddhist concept on the cycle of reincarnation. And you know where I'm going with this: birth, life, death, rebirth. The wheel of samsara. So that is the Buddhist concept. And remember, the goal of Buddhist practice is to be free of this wheel. So what about the Tao? Well, here's the circle of the Tao. Applied to that, it is similar to samsara, but not the same. We come from the Tao, we must eventually return to it. The circle continues on, which means it doesn't end upon your return. Because the circle continues on, you are going to manifest again at some point. So the idea is that prior to you being born in this lifetime, you were potentiality waiting for manifestation. After this lifetime is over, you go back to the state of nothingness, potentiality waiting to be manifested in physical reality. At some point in time, the right time comes around, you manifest again. So in view of everything that we can observe, we've covered heaven, earth, the myriad things, all the different aspects of it, all the reflections, the mirroring, the following of the different levels. In view of all of that, the one thing that I can observe, one idea that I can suggest is that physical death cannot be the end. If it is the end of you as an individual consciousness, then this would fly in the face in contradiction of everything else that we can observe. So then someone had better come up with an explanation why it is the only thing that is different. There has to be a pretty good reason for that. So my own conclusion that I will offer for your consideration is that we are here together for one another. That's the reason why we're gathering every Sunday. We're here for one another. And we will always return for one another. I will return for you, you will return for me. We will engage in the circular movement lifetime after lifetime. We will be here to help one another, to look after one another, and we will succeed in our quest to understand the Tao together. It's time to summarize the different levels. What are the different levels? Heaven, earth, myriad things, and human beings. So in Mandarin, you'll see that to the left, 天地万物人. So far, so good. Now, as I illustrated with the previous slides, these levels all reflect on one another. They all follow one another. So the examples that I used, the seasonal changes, is basically the earth following the heavenly movements of celestial bodies. Myriad things, the animal migration is basically the animals, the migration path following the seasonal changes of the earth. And we human beings are among the myriad things. We're living things too. For each one of these levels, I have chosen a representational graphic. Let me share that with you. For the heaven, I have this graphic that shows the orbital planes in a diagram format. So the planets circling around the sun. Of course, in actuality, the distance in space is so great that you can't put a colorful picture like this together, but I think this diagram will illustrate the basic principle involved. For the level of the earth, I have chosen this painting depicting seasonal changes, as you can see there. And this is basically winter transitioning, giving way to spring, then to summer, and then to autumn, and then back to winter again. It's cycles. For the level of the myriad things, I've chosen this image of salmons fighting against currents to return to the spawning grounds. So I like it because it is illustrating the cycle of life, and it's also returning to spawn. Very Tao-oriented. And with human beings, I've chosen two. One representing the Buddhism teachings that we've been discussing today and also in previous weeks. This is an image of the 1,000 hands Bodhisattva, the Guanyin, goddess of compassion, with the 1,000 hands reaching out to people in need to extend the hand of compassion in assistance. That's traditional Buddhism. But I don't want to end there. I want to bring in the Tao perspective, which is not so much about reaching out in compassion, although that's certainly part of the Tao. But the underlying essence of the Tao is that we are one. Our hands join together. We are here for one another. It is no accident that we gather here today to talk about the Tao. So it's the other perspective. Instead of hands reaching out, hands coming in to join together. You and me, all of us together as one. So this is the graphic that I want to use to summarize everything that we have talked about in the 4 different levels. So let's go a little bit further into the chapter. We are now on line 3. We are now focusing on the myriad things. Line 3 says, the myriad things of the world are born of being. Let's talk about that. Where do all the living things in the world come from? Well, we know that's not a difficult question. We know they can all be traced back to a source that is also a living thing. So you can be traced back to your parents. Your parents can be traced back to their grandparents. But this is not just for us, it's for every animal. It's also for all the plants. So for plants, we can easily see that a tree grew from a seed. We've all seen that. We all understand that. We know, going further back in time, the seed used to be inside the fruit, of course. We know, going further back, that the fruits used to hang from the branch of the parent tree. We can go back even further and say, well, the parent tree grew from a seed, which used to be inside the fruit, which used to hang from the branch of the grandparent tree. And it goes back and back and back. So what about you? Well, you know that physically you come from your biological parents, and mentally you are the product of your upbringing and education. The summation of your life experience. So this is who you are. Physically and mentally, this is who you are. Now the question, how far back in time can you go? You trace back to your parents, then to grandparents, then to great-grandparents, and then great-great-grandparents, and then great-great-great-grandparents. How far back can you go? And what if you trace back to a time before the Earth existed? So we know the Earth is 1.5 billion years old. Well, so there was a time, the universe is 14 billion years old. So there was, roughly 10 billion years in which the Earth did not exist. So you won't be able to trace it back to a living thing before that time. That's for sure. So the same question applies for plants. Where was the parent tree in that scenario, before the Earth existed? Where was your remote ancestor? Well, that remote ancestor also did not exist. So regardless of animals or plants, we are forced to admit that if you go back far enough, you quickly get to a point where the remote ancestor or the parent tree simply had no existence whatsoever. Okay, so with this right here, this is the last line of the Daodejing. There's a whole discussion to get into about the last line. Being is born of non-being. Another way that I want you to think of it is existence is born of non-existence. There's a huge discussion associated with that, and I see that we have 5 minutes left, so we should be jumping to the conclusion, to the summary for today. I'm going to save our discussion on line 4 for next time. I think you will find a lot in that discussion that is useful, and then we will do the paraphrase, and then we will wrap it back from line 4 back to line 1. So that is the standard sequence that we follow. But now we need to jump to the, to the summary. Here we go. So first of all, The summary will show the same graphic that you saw before, the different levels of heaven, earth, myriad things, and human beings. This is meant to remind you that the great circle of the Tao applies in every case. Then I want to draw your attention. Once you have this in mind, I want to draw your attention to the next slide. The next slide shows the graphic, which is now at the bottom, and then 4 lines from Daodejing 25. So in Mandarin, it's 人法地, which means humans follows the laws of the earth. And you have seen how that can be. So for instance, when we human farmers, cultivate crops, we're following the changing of seasons. For planting, for harvesting, we're following the changing of seasons, which is part of the transitional changes in the laws of the earth. And then 地法天, the second line, from, by the way, these 4 lines are from the very end of Daodejing chapter 25. So 地法天, earth follows the laws of heaven. How can that be? Well, as we have talked about today, it's the different patterns of circular movements reflecting one another, following one another. So earth, the changing of seasons, follows the laws of heaven, which is a circular path through the cosmos, the earth going around the sun. Then heaven follows the laws of Tao. So you can think of Tao as the laws of nature that governs everything. It governs our behavior, our interactions with one another too. And then lastly, Tao follows the laws of nature. So nature and Tao are often seen as synonymous with one another, that nature and Tao are one and the same. So the Tao is self-sufficient. The Tao follows itself. So keep that in mind, and we will have a lot more to say about the very last part of it, about being coming from non-being, before we do the paraphrase. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us travel safely. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.